Well, good evening and welcome everyone to our first spring lecture, which, as you probably know, is in lieu of the summer programme while we wait for the relaxation that will allow us to meet out again in the field. So this is the first one of those sessions, and I'm now going to pass you over to Emily, who will introduce our speaker for tonight.
Hi, so Adam Mantell works for the Ulster Wildlife Trust in partnership with the Ministry of Defence. He takes care of the dunes in Ballykinler and Magilligan, it's easy for me to say, that are used for a variety of military and PSNI training purposes. He works with the camp commanders, ecologists, NIE grazers to improve the ecological conditions of the sites. He gets involved in a wide range of matters, including grazing rights, asset management, setting works programs, conservation projects, and coastal erosion. So when he's not working for the Ulster Wildlife Trust, he runs a small consultancy specialising in invertebrate surveying and has completed projects for many organisations, including the RSPB, councils, community groups, developers, national parks, and Wildlife Service and the National Trust. And hopefully we will be able to get a visit up to Magilligan and Ballykinler this year. Fingers crossed. Yeah, Adam, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Emily, for that very warm welcome, and really nice to see so many people here tonight.
Adam, I'm about to mute everyone, and then you can unmute yourself, and we roll.
Okay. Yep, no problem.
Let's mute all.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. I was just saying, yeah, thanks for the invite to come and talk to you tonight. I'm not sure it'll be quite as entertaining as a day out, but I'll do my best. And really pleased to see so many people here. It's really quite a good number. We've got about 45 people or so. It's really nice to see. Yeah,
47 and going up.
47. There's probably some screens with several people on them as well. So yeah, really good turnout, and thanks for that. Okay, so yeah, as Emily's already said, I'm Adam Mantell, and I'm a conservation officer working for Ulster Wildlife, and I'm involved in a partnership with Ministry of Defence. And the two sites that I look after are shown in these sort of panoramic photos on the screen. I'm sure all of you will recognise the pretty distinctive view in the horizon there of the Mourne Mountains. And this photo is taken from Ballykinler, which is adjacent to Murlock. And again, I'm sure I'm teaching many of you to suck eggs and you'll know exactly where that is. But it sort of shows the nature of the site, quite wide open grasslands with areas of scrub. The second site that I look after is Magilligan Strand, or at least the part of it that's owned by the Ministry of Defence. And yeah, again, you can see the sort of Benevina Hills in the background there, sweeping away down to Benone and downhill down at this far left-hand end. And this gives quite a nice sort of characteristic shot of the dunes here, where we've got these, one of the features that the site's quite famous for, these parallel dune ridges. So lots of dune systems have arc-shaped dunes. Magilligan, we have these interesting parallel dune ridges, which are quite an unusual feature and are part of the ASSI citation for the site. I'm just going to move on now. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the sites, what the Ministry of Defence is doing to manage them, what some of the issues are we have around site management. I'll go on to talk about how we're dealing with some of those issues through some quite novel, at least for Ireland, dune restoration projects. And I'll then go on to talk about some of the issues that we may we already are facing, to be honest, that are going to become probably more prominent in the future, particularly around coastal erosion. But it's just worth stopping, I think, to look at that rather lovely photo on the right-hand side there. And that is a view of marsh orchids and a variety of other things. There's a bit of probably bird's foot trefoil down here, maybe kidney vetch there, catsia there, and a whole variety of other things. And that's a view of part of the grassland in the dune slacks at Magilligan. And that, so we get a really good display of flowers in the slacks in the summer. Really kind of late June is probably the best time to see those. So just to orient us geographically, again, most of you will probably know this, but Magilligan is right up in the north on the Londonderry coast, and sort of covers part of the Foyle estuary down there. Ballykinler is right down in the opposite corner of the country, so next to Murlock. So really quite opposite ends of the territory in Northern Ireland as far as those two go. But that's not the only difference in these two sites. There's quite a few other differences really in terms of their ecology and what the Ministry of Defence are dealing with there. So at Ballykinler, just a few sort of techie details really. We've got 360 hectares, which is nearly 900 acres of ASSI and SAC habitat. And the site's particularly good for the species-rich dune grassland and also the acid dune heath, which is dominated by heather. I think I did read somewhere that Ballykinler and Murlock have something like 10% of the total area of acid dune heath in the entirety of the United Kingdom. So Ballykinler is a comparatively old dune system, so we think it's probably somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 years old. And because it's so old, a lot of the shelly fragments have leached out of the sand, so basically been dissolved by acidic rainwater. And what that's left us with is quite a highly acidic environment in terms of dune systems. And that has had a kind of profound effect on the vegetation that's able to survive there. So, say parts of it are proper dune heath, which are dominated by heather and other sort of really very acid-loving habitats. And the plants that are in the species-rich dune grassland, again, are things that are more acid-loving types of species. So, trying to think what we've got there. Things like lesser meadow rue and stuff like that. Magilligan, very different. So it's a much bigger site for a start. So 600 hectares of ASSI and SAC dune grassland, and which is approximately 1,500 acres. And for many of you, acres will be much more understandable than hectares, at least if you're anything like me. And the key things at Magilligan really are the much more alkaline species-rich dune grasslands, but particularly the dune slacks. And Magilligan has most of the dune slacks in Northern Ireland within it. And both of the sites are used extensively for both military and police training. So across both of those sites, I think Tony, who's the commanding officer who's just retired, told me that they fire around 6 million rounds a year across those sites. And most of the lead is caught in lead catches, so it doesn't, or caught in bullet catches, so it doesn't end up in the environment. But they've also been used for military use for quite a long time. So there's records going back as far as the Boer War, which obviously I don't remember, but I think was sometime in the late 1800s. A few interesting facts that as part of Ballykinler, which is known as Cavalry Hill, because that was where the troops used to train riding their horses up and down Cavalry Hill. Obviously that doesn't happen anymore, but that was obviously an important use of that site at the time. Both sites are quite rich also in sort of military archaeology, so there's quite a lot of work been done to look at things like the trench systems that were dug there. There's surviving examples that are intact of trench systems that are probably quite unique certainly in Britain and probably in Europe. A lot of these things have been destroyed over time, and the MOD have been doing quite a lot of, or funding quite a lot of archaeological research in some of those areas. But it's not just the trenches, there's also various structures that were dug, things like command posts and that kind of thing that were dug, and also other bits and pieces of sort of military hardware, if I can put it like that. So one of the scheduled ancient monuments up at Magilligan is a bunch of structures that used to be a heavy air battery, and they cover several acres, and there's not that much to see now, but lots of metalwork and blocks of concrete sticking out of the ground. But undoubtedly these sites, as well as their kind of ecological interest, also have a significant archaeological interest. And in terms of military training and police training, there is quite a lot of, as I say, firing goes on. That's both on fixed ranges and also on what they call field firing areas, where the troops are moving through the terrain from one place to another, practicing manoeuvres and using the sort of cover that's available from within the site. And also quite a lot of firearms training for the police takes place. Okay, so I'll come on now to talk about some of the management challenges we got on these sites. Most of you will probably recognise the photographs in front of you, but we'll just take them from top right to start off with. We have a major issue, particularly on both sites, to be honest, but particularly at Ballykinler with bracken. Because the sites are fairly dry, bracken really likes it there, and we spend quite a lot of time trying to keep the bracken under control. We don't have a particular problem per se with the bracken. It's simply that if it starts to take over the site, we lose the fine herbs and the other plants that we want to see in the sward that should be making up the species-rich dune grassland components, because they cannot compete with the height of the canopy that the bracken creates. Same is really true of the next plant round to the right, which you'll all recognise as gorse or whins, as some people call them. They're a major problem down at Ballykinler for several reasons. One reason is that they are a major challenge to military training. So if your site is wall-to-wall gorse, it's very hard for the troops to move through it when they're trying to train. It presents a significant fire risk, and we've seen some pretty horrendous examples, particularly in the Mourns in recent days, of wildfire, and it's not. And we do have wildfires at both sites, basically because sometimes tracer rounds are used and need to be used as part of the sort of essential military training. And those tracer rounds can set fire to the ground layer. What we don't want particularly is sort of catastrophic gorse fires taking place, and we have had, not during my time with the MOD, but it has happened within the last 10 years that we've had quite significant areas burnt really quite badly. We're trying to avoid that, and to avoid that we have to clear the gorse. I'll leave the metal objects till the end, but the next thing down round in the circle clockwise is blackthorn. So not something that many people necessarily would think of as an invasive species. It's not a particularly significant issue at all at Ballykinler, but up at Magilligan, it's the single biggest problem that we have. And trying to keep that under control is, again, quite a major undertaking for us. I'm pleased to say we're starting to get on top of that, whereas we're not starting to get on top of the gorse at Ballykinler. And this year I made a decision that we'd stop cutting the blackthorn at Magilligan, and we would concentrate more of our money and resources on controlling the gorse at Ballykinler, just because the bracken is getting out of control and the blackthorn isn't so much. The blackthorn also is quite a good plant in terms of the wildlife that it supports. I'm not saying that bracken and gorse aren't, but we do have one particular thing that lives in the blackthorn, which is the small egger moth, and that Magilligan is the last site in Northern Ireland, and really only one of 2 places in the whole of Ireland where that species is surviving in any great numbers. The other one being down at the Burren in County Clare, where there's quite a few small eggers still around down there. But it's a species that's really fallen victim to intensive agricultural habitat management. If hedges weren't being flailed every year, we would see that species, along with other things like brown hair streaks, probably doing much better more widely across the landscape. But because of the way we manage the blackthorn up at Magilligan, so we cut it in pockets and we allow areas of lower growth to grow up before we cut it, that species is doing really very well indeed. So there will be probably tens of thousands of caterpillars on the site every year. So as long as we don't change our management, that's something I would anticipate will continue to be a feature of that site into the future. And there's no reason why we would change the way that we're managing the site as far as that goes. A lot of people probably recognise the last photograph with the orange berries. That's the spiky horror that's known as sea buckthorn. We have that at both sites. To be honest, it is a big problem for us, but it's not as big a problem, believe it or not, as gorse or blackthorn, despite some of the horror stories you will hear about that plant in dune systems. But what we're doing with it, because we're concentrating on the other 2 things at the moment, is we've made a kind of management decision really that we will stop it expanding from where it is its current strongholds any further into the site. And as soon as we reach a point in the future where we've got the gorse and the blackthorn under control better, we will then attempt to eradicate the sea buckthorn. We'd like to do that, not least of which because it spreads quite rapidly by seeds, and that doesn't just affect our property, it affects neighbouring landowners. So at some point we will have a concerted effort to try and get rid of the sea buckthorn there. It's also interesting to note that out of the 4 species that we find quite problematic, only one of them is non-native. So sea buckthorn is the only one that's not native to Ireland, which is just perhaps a different situation for what most people might intuitively expect. So the other management challenge that we've got is around kind of the legacy of military use of the site. And what you can see in that photo in the bottom right-hand corner are 2-inch mortars, and on top of them is a 20mm round. The mortars were fired extensively across the site, really from the First World War onwards for practice, for obvious reasons. Most of them are duds, so they never had anything particularly dangerous in them. So most of them would have been filled with concrete, and they were really just using them for range finding and practice. But just occasionally we come across a live mortar, and there are quite a few what are called Stokes mortars lying around from the First World War, which are quite large things and potentially quite dangerous. And the Ballykinler end of Magilligan was also used as a naval bombardment area during the Second World War. So ships were stationed or anchored quite a distance off the coast and were firing quite large shells into the dunes in Ballykinler, again, really for range finding practice. I've never seen one of those. I don't particularly want to, but I've seen an awful lot of 2-inch mortars. But it does present us with quite a few challenges in terms of how we manage the sites. So any areas where we want to break the ground or dig anything up, we have to have those areas cleared by explosive ordnance clearance specialists before we can go in there with the diggers and start to do any groundworks. And plus it also places constraints on what farmers can do, so they can't just go hammering posts into the ground if they want to put a new piece of fence up, or even replace an existing fence. All those have to be carefully checked because of this risk of unexploded ordnance on these two sites. There are some parts of the sites that are absolutely littered with pieces of ordnance, and I suspect that's one reason why these sites will probably remain in military ownership for quite some time. So gradually these things are sort of degrading, and eventually they'll become inert. But when I first started work with the MOD, I was chatting to one of the guys, one of the MOD guys there who does, who also sort of helps look after the Rangers, and I said, do these things become more dangerous or less dangerous over time? And he said, well, it depends. And I'm not one for finding out, but it is a significant issue for us on the sites, and because I'm actually one of the very few people that spends any significant amount of time out in some of the more remote parts of these sites, and they are big areas of land. I quite often are the person that finds them first, so I report them through to the commanding officer. They call out the bomb disposal squad, and they then dispose of them either on site or take them away and dispose of them somewhere else. And I think there was a period when I was single-handedly keeping the bomb disposal people busier than anything else in Northern Ireland, which gives you a sort of an idea of the sheer volume of the thousands and thousands of pieces of potentially dangerous munitions that are lying around on these sites. So I'll talk a little bit now about some of the sort of management solutions that we're employing. So on the left-hand side there, you'll see a Galloway cow, a beef cow with a suckler. That's down at Ballykinler, and our grazier there runs about 60 of those cows with a couple of bulls and calves at foot, and also somewhere in the order of about 120 sheep. And the stocking rates are very low on these sites because the productivity of them is very low. Basically, they've never had any substantial amounts of fertilizer applied, and in most parts of the site they never had any fertilizer at all applied. And if that did happen, it would be pretty catastrophic for the ecology, so we're keen that it doesn't. And these cows basically graze the site for us. They do a number of different jobs. So first of all, and probably most importantly from my point of view, they help to maintain the species-rich sward that we need. So there was a period from around the 1970s for probably into the 1990s where these sites were not grazed at all, which was pretty catastrophic, and we ended up with all kinds of problems with wildfires, losing the ecological condition of the site, and basically becoming really problematic for the troops to move around because, you know, when the grass is 2 or 3 feet deep and you can't see where the holes are, where the old World War II trenches are, people were falling down them, breaking legs, and generally not good for anybody. So these cows have done a really great job for us, and they're bringing the site from unfavourable condition. We're now back into what's called favourable recovering condition in habitat directive terms, and I'm hopeful that with a little bit more time we should get the site back into favourable condition. That may take a little while, and basically what we need is the herb component to increase in the sward. Really the only way to do that is to graze it in the correct way. And at both sites what we're looking for is to have the sward somewhere around 4 inches high, but with plenty of variation. So probably a number of people know that cows are pretty generalist grazers. They'll eat almost anything, and they're pretty indiscriminate about what they eat. So they will wrap their tongues around whatever's green in the sward, they'll pull it up and they'll eat it. Sheep are different, they're much more picky eaters, and they will graze around particular plants that aren't palatable. And what we're looking for is a little bit of a mosaic of some areas that are shorter and some areas that are a little bit longer. And that's really what we're looking for to get the site back into favourable condition. There's also a big role played by rabbits, which is something that's missing at the moment, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So this gigantic orange machine on the right-hand side is, well, the object on the front of the arm is basically an enormous circular saw blade. Because of the issues with UXOs and also getting access onto the site, we find it difficult to either get volunteers or large numbers of anybody really into the site to cut scrub by hand, as many of the other organisations who are managing conservation sites might prefer to do, and also because of the UXO risk. So we tend to use heavy machinery, and basically those saw blades will rip through pretty much anything. I've seen them cut through sort of gorse trunks. The gorse might be sort of 10, 12 feet high with a 4-inch diameter trunk on it, and it goes through it like it wasn't even there. They're quite unbelievable things. But they're very efficient at clearing scrub, and that's the sort of primary means through which we clear the scrub. The actual scrub cutting is quite expensive, so that costs us somewhere in the region of about £8,000 a hectare. And in the following years after that, in order to make sure that we don't kind of lose that investment in cutting the scrub, we have a follow-up programme of spraying with herbicides. Ideally, we'd not be using herbicides, but the scale of these sites is such that it's really the only feasible management tool for enabling us to cover the ground as quickly as we could. We sort of minimise the impact of that and use as little herbicide as possible by only spraying with knapsacks. So it's all with hand lancers. So it's not, we're not sort of broadcast spraying through booms. The only exception to that actually is bracken, simply because there's a bracken specific herbicide product on the market called Agilox. And when that's on license, so when we're allowed to use that, that'd be the preferred solution for bracken. Obviously all this costs a lot of money, and between the two sites we spend between these sort of grazing, scrub cutting, spraying, and also some of the conservation projects I'll come on to talk about in a minute, we spend somewhere in the region of £140,000 every single year. I mean, that's spread across a big area of land, but it is a significant financial investment for the Ministry of Defence, but we do seem to be getting good results back from that, with the probable exception that we can't get on, we're struggling really to get on top of the gorse at Ballykinler because it just grows so fast and really spreads so quickly. Okay, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about what's been happening with dune systems in recent decades, and why this is presenting us with some issues. So the aerial photo on the left-hand side there isn't either Ballykinler or Magilligan, it's actually Murlock. And the reason why I've got that is because I couldn't find a sort of photo of Ballykinler from the right period. So that photo is from, I think, around the 1960s. And what you can actually see in the distance there, that is Ballykinler. And I think by looking at this, you can see that probably somewhere between 30 and 50% of the entire ground surface on those sites was basically bare sand. That's partly down to the fact that, you know, these sites were used and abused by the Ministry of Defence for training during the Second World War, and the impacts of that would probably still have been felt at that time. But if you look at any photograph of any dune system pretty much in Northern Europe from around that time, you will see extensive areas of bare sand. This photo in the middle here is of Ballykinler, and these linear features here are the sort of fixed target ranges. But you can see that we've pretty much gone full circle from having extensive areas of bare sand visible on the left-hand side to having virtually no bare sand whatsoever in this much more up-to-date photo. The reason for that is primarily myxomatosis, nutrient deposition of agricultural ammonia and other sources of ammonia being deposited on the land is probably also playing a smaller role, but certainly myxomatosis has vastly reduced the rabbit population. I count the rabbits every year, believe it or not, by driving along the roads on a sort of preset route. At Ballykinler this year, I counted about 30 rabbits, and at Magilligan there were only 2. So that gives you a bit of an idea of what we're dealing with. Those rabbits would have been sort of instrumental in creating the type of landscape that we're looking at on the left-hand side. I'm not necessarily saying that we want sort of up to 50% of these sites being bare sands. I don't think, even though that may well be what happened historically, I'm not sure that's actually going to give us the best outcomes ecologically. But what we do need is more bare sand than we've got at the moment. And I'll talk about the reasons for that in a minute, looking at this slide. So what I've got on this slide are a number of things that are dependent on that early succession type of habitat with lots of bare sand in it. This rather lovely little moth here is, some of you may know, is the scarce crimson and gold moth. So again, this species has got a very narrow geographical distribution. I think I'm right in saying it's now extinct in Great Britain. The only places where it's reasonably abundant in Ireland are the North Antrim coast, and the biggest population again is probably at Magilligan, and down in the Burren and some of the high quality limestone habitat in Galway. The reason for that is that it requires time growing amongst moss on a largely bare substrate. So in the Burren and the South Galway grasslands, that bare substrate is provided by the exposed outcrops of limestone, and up at Magilligan and along the North Antrim coast in Northern Ireland, that habitat is provided by bare sand. So we think that these scarce crimson gold moths, we're not absolutely 100% sure, but we think that most of them are probably living in the south-facing sides of the dune ridges that are still only partially vegetated. So what you tend to see is a mat of moss, bit of bare sand, bits of thyme growing through it, and that provides the heat and the warmth that this species needs to develop. This moth here is a thing called the Portland moth, and that has been recorded probably as late as, I think, the 1990s at Murlock. It was almost certainly present at Ballykinler at that time. And this is a species, again, that needs bare sand. So it feeds on creeping willow, and it pupates in bare ground at the base of the creeping willow. And basically at the moment, we don't have any creeping willow with bare ground at the base of it because we no longer have that rabbit grazing. So it's quite likely, partly because we know that habitat no longer really exists in the form that that species would require, and partly because it's not been recorded. It's quite likely, I mean, we can't prove it because proving extinctions is very difficult, but it's really quite likely that that species will have disappeared from the site. This middle photograph here is a plant called smooth cat's ear. That, I think, again, I'm right in saying that Magilligan is the last site in Ireland for that plant, and that requires Well, the only place it exists up there now is around the edges of some old dune blowouts towards the back of the site, where sand was formerly sort of blowing out of the ground, out of these blowouts and onto the adjacent habitat. That blown sand was keeping the sward open. So what we would have had is basically little bits of moss with these early succession plants like the smooth cats here, growing in amongst an awful lot of sand. As you can see from this photo, there's very little sand there now. The sward is starting to close over. The whole lot is becoming a thick thatch of moss with grass in it, and that species is sadly disappearing at an exponential rate. And I'll talk about what we're trying to do about that in a minute or two. The photo on the far right there, sorry, is a bit of a puzzling one from at first glance. So what you've got is the tip of a pencil. I really put that in just to demonstrate just how tiny this little liverwort here is, which is inside this red ring. So that is a liverwort called petalwort, or Petalophyllum ralphsii. And that is, believe it or not, is one of the special area conservation features for the site. That now exists in just one place, which is maybe a quarter of the size of a tennis court, and is now extremely vulnerable. So last year I counted, last November I counted as many of these as I ever have on the site, and I managed to find a grand total of 6 thalli of this particular liverwort. And in April this year I didn't find any at all. And it's really again falling victim to the fact that we no longer got any blowing sand existing on the site. If there was more sand blowing about, this would find conditions much more to its liking, and it would really reduce the competition from the other plants that you can sort of see in the sward here. So what it really likes is a slightly humic, very, very sandy bed with about 30% of the ground covered in other plants. And at the moment in that area, what we're getting is all these sort of sedges and I think that's probably a bit of catsia there. There's all kinds of plants popping up here, and the sward is just closing over, and we're likely to lose that plant at sort of some stage. And we are in the process of trying to put some things into effect to see if we can give it a slightly brighter future on the site. And I'll talk about some of those things now. This photograph these 2 photographs on the left-hand side here are an excavation that we made in the dune slack. So this low-lying area that we can see sort of stretching off into the distance is a dune slack. Just in case anybody doesn't know what dune slacks are, they're very wet, low-lying, always flat areas that are between the dune ridges, and basically they're areas that correspond closely with the water table. So what would have happened when these dunes were being formed originally is that the wind would have been blowing sand about, and when it had scoured the sand basically down to the water table, the wetness that was being drawn up by capillary action from the groundwater table would have stuck the sand grains together basically, or held them together and stopped the wind blowing them around. And because the water table is basically flat in this area, that would have given us these extensive flat areas between the dune ridges. These areas are really important for the ecology of the dunes because they're so wet. Well, they're wet in winter, they can flood, and often dry in summer because the water table drops and the sand quickly dries out. Provides really, really harsh conditions that support potentially a limited range of plants, but often a range of plants that are very, very rare that you won't find in many other situations or in any other, or if anywhere else. So what we got here, so we dug down, you can see the shape of it. It's just a small excavation about maybe 20 meters across, 10 meters wide. So we this is a photo of this, exactly the same thing in the winter, and you can see the difference between the winter and summer. And we've got the water table here very, very close to the ground surface. And that will mean that lots and lots of plants simply won't live there. They're not able to tolerate that degree of waterlogging. And that's to try and, the reason why we've done this, you may be wondering why, this is really to try and recreate the earliest stages of dune slack development. So obviously when dune slacks were first being formed, they would have had lots of bare sand and quite a different community of plants and animals from what we can see around this area now. So obviously that's all in common with much of the rest of the dune system, vegetating up quite heavily. And this was to attempt to recreate that very, very first embryonic dune slack stage. And I'll talk in a minute about what we found from that, but that's been one of the interesting projects that we've run. This slide with the mini digger in it is doing a slightly different thing. So basically what we're doing is scraping off the maybe top 8 to 10 inches of marram grass in an area where the succession has proceeded quite far to expose a bed of bare sand. We've done 5 of these, what I've called scrapes on the dune ridges, for want of a better word. And we're going to monitor those over the next few years, and we'll see, basically just see what happens. So what I'm hoping is that it doesn't immediately recolonize with marram grass. And unfortunately, that is a possibility, I have to say. And with a bit of luck, what we'll see is the type of habitat that the scarce crimson and gold moth requires, forming in at least some of these pockets. So they're all slightly different. They've all got different aspects. They're on different slopes with different degrees of exposure. It'll be really interesting to see how those shape up in the next few years, and whether it simply quickly recovers with marram grass, or whether we start to get those early succession communities being able to survive for any length of time or not. And that will tell us something about how we want to pursue any further projects into the future. Because what we're doing really here are very much experimental things to try and figure out what the best way of proceeding with those is in the future. So we may do some of these things, but on a much larger scale. So in South Wales, for example, on some of the dune systems there that are with projects being run by Natural Resources Wales, they're not sort of messing about with a few tens of square meters. They're doing these projects on hectares in size, and that's potentially somewhere where we might want to look to be getting to at Magilligan. This final picture in the bottom right-hand corner is the area where that little tiny plant, the smooth cat's ear, is still extant. So it's really only present around some of these sandy blowout features. So these are basically just holes in the dunes where, and because there's exposed sand, the wind can scour them and it blows sand out onto the surrounding land. The only place now where smooth cat's ear is found is really within about 5 or 10 meters of the edges of these features, and only in fairly limited places around those. And unfortunately, the monitoring I've been doing of those over the last few years, as I say, has been basically showing that it's disappearing at an exponential rate. Last year, we sort of teamed up with a company some of you may have heard with, or a charity, in fact, True Harvest Seeds, and we now have a very limited amount of smooth cat's ear seed in their seed bank, which is run by, I think, by Kew Gardens. That provides us with a bit of a resource to fall back on if the plant does disappear. So we've got some of those plants which may be potentially sort of unique Irish genetic material. So it may well be different from British or European examples of the species. But what we really need to do is, because we're only able to harvest seeds off 2 plants last year, is to collect more seed, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that this year. But it was really, really hard to find any plants at all last year. We're just going to have to do the best we can with that. The other thing we're going to do is try and create some new blowouts. So basically what I've done is select an area towards the back of the site, which is fairly close to these existing blowouts. And what we're going to do is something similar to what you can see in the photograph above, basically, is just strip the top layer of dense vegetation, that sort of turf off the top, and allow that to wind scour. And if we can recreate that type of habitat where we're getting sand blown out onto the surrounding land, we'll then have something where we'll be able to replant smooth cat's-ear, maybe as plugs or just as seeds, possibly, if we've got enough of them. And that will hopefully provide a more secure future for that plant. But really, until we've got what we think is a reasonably stable habitat for that plant, there's no point us trying to do anything with that seed that's currently in storage with Kew Gardens, because whilst we might be able to grow some of them, they'll only be there for a very limited amount of time, unless we're sure that those features are going to persist for a reasonable amount of time. But this is just giving you really a bit of an idea of some of the projects that the Ministry of Defence, working in partnership with Ulster Wildlife, is funding to try and look after some of these endangered plants that we've got, plants and animals that we've got on these sites. And in fact, we will be working with True Harvest Seeds to collect seeds off some of the other rare plants that we've got here. So there's a particularly rare thing down at Ballykinler that again is in a very, very small area. Matthew will know what I'm talking about here. A little thing called blue fleabane. So we're hoping to be able to harvest some seed off that. There's another one called Leicester Meadow Rue, which we'll probably try and harvest from. And there's a number of things, particularly in the slacks at Magilligan, that we'll try and harvest seed from there. So marsh helleborine, some of the orchids that we've got there. And up at Magilligan, we've got a rare plant which grows around the edges of the slacks, sort of in moss tussocks, which is roundleaf wintergreen, which is only one of 2 sites in Ireland for that plant that are known. That's a tricky little blighter because it doesn't flower every year. And when it does flower, it flowers for a very short period. So we'll do our best to catch that one. But there's no guarantee that we'll manage to get to it on time, but we'll do our best. But that plant is actually doing reasonably well at the moment because the habitat is suitable for it. And we will sort of continue to keep an eye on that, and we'll have other opportunities to collect seed from it as we go forward into the future. So that's just a bit of a flavour for some of the things that we're doing there. And I've just got a few examples here of what's been happening with the excavation that we got in the dune slacks. So here's a few things that have popped up in there. So this rather messy looking thing here that looks like a goose has had a bad dose of diarrhea is in fact one of the things, sort of key indicators really, of early succession embryonic dune slack habitat. That jelly-like substance is probably a cyanobacteria, so basically an algal mat, which is sort of a critical feature of these slack habitats, which is a good indicator that we're getting the right kind of results from it. We've got this plant here, which is some of you will recognise as the horsetail. That's actually a variegated horsetail, and that's the dune slack form of variegated horsetail. Again, quite a rare plant. I was really surprised how quickly that appeared. So literally within 12 months of us completing that slack excavation back in 2018, this plant had already appeared. It's present elsewhere at Magilligan, but it's not particularly widespread. And I can only assume that the plant has a viable long-term resting stage, because it's not just one of these that's appeared in this dune slack excavation. There's quite a few of them. So I doubt it's material that's just blown in there, that it's horsetail spores that have just blown in there randomly. I think it was probably present all along within the kind of soil sand matrix, if that's the right word, and has taken the opportunity to kind of explode into life again. We've got another liverwort down here. This is a thing called Priasia quadrata that's growing in amongst these jointed rush stems. So again, that's another alkaline, rich, preferring calcifuge, I think, liverwort species. That's nice to see. And we've also had this plant here, which is, name is temporarily escaping me. Yeah, sorry folk, I can't remember what that one's called. Bog pimpernel, that's it. That's Anagala, some people may know that better as. But yeah, so another quite a nice June slack species of very damp ground. So what all this is telling me really is that the work that we're doing is actually working. The good news is that that will help us sort of build an evidence base really, so that we'll be able to go back to people like NIA, and also it'll make my life a lot easier in seeking more funding to say that we want to do some more of these projects, potentially on a larger scale. What we're not short of is fairly degraded slack habitat, and by that I mean stuff that's starting to be invaded by burnet rose and marram grass and lots of other kind of very general Juneland plants. But these kind of embryonic slack habitats are very, very rare on the site. There's a very, very limited number of areas where that kind of thing exists, and probably nothing at that really embryonic stage. So that's been a really successful project, which I'm very pleased about. So finally, I'm going to come on and talk about, well, some current issues, but also what might be going on in the future on both sites, at both Ballykinler and Magilligan. This photograph up on the screen now is the back of one of the firing ranges at Magilligan. So as far as we can tell, this range was constructed probably back in the 1950s, and what you can see here is a lot of concrete debris on the beach. So that is actually the former gallery for the range. So that would have been the, well, basically several hundred tons of concrete that were holding up the, what they call the range furniture. So things like the targets and pulley systems and all that kind of thing. And this tarmac that you can see is a road that formerly went out in this direction and swept back around and re-entered the land, probably about 100 metres behind where the photograph was taken from. This little blue obelisk isn't anything to worry about. That's just me covering up one of the range staff who I really shouldn't be popping them into the photos, if you see what I mean. So erosion is a feature at the site. This is eroded back further than we've seen kind of in living memory. There is thought to be a 40-year cycle of sediment transport onshore and offshore. So anybody who knows this area sort of geomorphologically will know that there's a current that takes sand out along the coast, out to sea. It's deposited in a set of sandbanks called the Tons Bank, and then eventually it works its way back round onto the shore again. So there's no new fine material, no new sand being added to the system, or very little. And what we've got is really what was deposited at the end of the last ice age that's being moved around in a colossal loop, several kilometres offshore and then back on again. But this erosion event is different in that it's gone further back inland than we've seen before in about 60 odd years, probably more than that actually. So it really is quite an exceptional event. The indications are that this event and other erosion issues that we've got down at Ballykinler are attributable to climate change, and partly down to sea level, but more particularly down to an increase in storminess and minor changes in wind direction. The wind direction is important in that it changes obviously the direction of waves onto the shore, and that will can radically, even minor changes, particularly combined with additional storminess, can radically alter the sediment movement over what we've seen historically. And I'm sure I don't need to say this to everybody. I'm sure you've been all keeping your ears on the, or eyes on the news over the last 24 hours, but the climate change bill was passed to some resistance from certain quarters, and I think it's kind of a timely reminder really that you know, whilst we do need to undoubtedly protect rural communities and protect the sort of agricultural systems we've got in place, it's also important to remember that you know, this is not something that's happening in the future. It's very much happening now, and this is one of the consequences. It's also causing a great deal of concern, particularly to rural communities down extensive parts of the west coast of Ireland, where erosion is likely to accelerate over the next few years, and is, I think, causing some people living in those areas fairly major headaches. So, and I think all that needs to be taken into account alongside, you know, what the sort of economic impacts on farming are. So it's far from a simple simple problem. There's many facets to it, and certainly we are actively dealing with some of those at the moment. Down at Ballykinler, we've got an issue with erosion along the Dundrum Channel, where again we're likely to lose a road, which is pretty critical to maintaining what the MOD calls safe space. So that's making sure that we can get things like fire engines and ambulances into the site safely, so that, God forbid, if there are any accidents or we get a particularly catastrophic fire, that we can get the fire brigade in and we can get ambulances in quickly to get people taken off to hospital, basically. I mean, there's not been any accidents for a very long time, but we certainly do need to retain the ability to do that for pretty obvious reasons. So this is just another couple of pictures about what's happening up at Magilligan. So this is the range we were talking about. It's a grenade range. This is a picture from somewhere in the region of 2 or 3 years ago. And what we can see here is the range is still intact. So that is all the concrete that's now on the beach is this sort of dark bar that we're looking at here. And within that time period, last 2 or 3 years, we've lost probably about 100 metres of land to the sea. And we're fortunate at Magilligan that, and this is the road that you can see is now out to sea, basically. We're fortunate at Magilligan that we've got quite a lot of capacity to retreat further back into the site because it's such a big space. And that area there is here, and it's out towards Magilligan Point. And I've got another slide which I'll bring up now, which shows basically how things have changed roughly in about the last 5 or 6 years. So again, this is the grenade range. You can see the erosion that's happened there, and this red line is where the coast used to be. So that is about 250, 300 metres out to sea now. Let me rephrase that. The sea is now 300 metres further inland than it used to be, even within that very short period of time. So you can see that, yeah, dunes are very dynamic systems. They change rapidly, and along this piece of the coast here, that change is happening very, very rapidly at the moment. For reasons that we're trying to get some investigation done to tell us what's likely to happen in the future. There's other critical bits of military infrastructure in here. So this building here, if any of you have ever walked around Magilligan Point, this is the Sanger, as it's called, or the lookout tower, which contains basically the monitoring equipment that keeps anybody on the beach safe and stops them walking into the danger templates for the rangers. And that's quite an important thing. It'd be really helpful for us to know what's going to happen to this shoreline here, because we may need to move that further inland. That's already been moved inland once within the last 20 years. So we are looking potentially at having to move that lookout tower inland again. So that just gives you a bit of a flavour of what's going on with erosion and climate change. Yeah, here's just a bit more detail really, but I was talking to one of the well-known coastal geomorphologists a few years ago when we had a study done at Ballykinler looking at the erosion problems there. And he said what tends to happen when you have hard defences along shorelines is that when they start to break up, the sea will quickly cut in behind them. This is that 400 or so tons of concrete that came out of the back of that range and sort of flopped 15 feet down onto the beach. And what we can see now is that erosion is indeed starting to cut in behind what effectively is very similar to a short piece of hard coastal defence. So the erosion in this area is now starting to accelerate beyond probably what it would have done before. And then again, that illustrates some of the problems that happen when you start to interfere with natural coastal processes. So at some point, this erosion will probably cut in behind this. These blocks of concrete will then be further out to sea, and they'll probably be lower down on the beach because the sand will get washed out from underneath them. And they will then not be such an issue in terms of causing erosion to happen here. But because of the advice we've been given, we have got no intentions of trying to put in any sort of hard defences to try and provide additional protection around this part of the coast, and nor indeed at Ballykinler, in the belief that it's actually likely to make the situation worse, if not for the military, then potentially for other landowners elsewhere around that part of the coast. So we're taking quite a responsible approach to it, I think. So just to wrap up really, thinking about the future, we've got obviously some problems happening. So we know with climate change that we're likely to see more erosion around these coasts. That won't just affect the MOD, it'll affect a whole variety of other landowners. And we are starting to prepare for that now. In terms of one of my other interests, really, just invertebrates, it's a bit of a mixed picture, really. So we are probably starting to lose one or two things that are what we call sort of Arctic or boreal species. So I think probably 2020, I went out with Roy Anderson around parts of the North Antrim coast. One of the things we were looking for was a little weevil called Oteorhynchus arcticus. And as the name suggests, that is a sort of cold-loving species, which has probably been around that coast since the last ice age for thousands and thousands of years, and has been clinging on in some of the very exposed coastal turf, where the temperatures are low, they're generally in the shade, and the wind speeds are high, and it's generally quite wet, which seems to be the conditions that species likes. Unfortunately, when we look for it, we could not find a single one. We think what has happened is that there is an enzyme system in that beetle that stops operating above, I think, 26 degrees it is. And we think that temperature threshold has been exceeded in the last few years too often. And probably there's either very, very few of them left, or the entire population has gone. Only time will tell, and hopefully it'll make a recovery. But it does say that particularly these sort of cold-loving species are likely to suffer. But on the other hand, there are whole suites of invertebrates that are likely to find conditions in Ireland suitable when they weren't before. And, you know, there's lots and lots of examples of those, really. So many of you will have heard that the comma butterfly is now sort of sweeping its way up the east coast. That species is likely to continue to thrive here and will expand its range. And it's probably a fairly welcome addition to the fauna. There's probably other things that aren't quite such welcome additions to the fauna. But overall, I think we're likely to see, in terms of invertebrates, probably actually, other than the things that have been lost through habitat damage, particularly through agricultural intensification, we're likely to see a greater variety of invertebrates in Ireland. And certainly in the last few years, I've been finding things in my garden that I know for a fact were not there even 5 years ago. So things like hairy shield bugs and nursery web spiders are now pretty common in my garden, and they were simply not present 5 years ago. And that is almost certainly down to warming of the climate. The observant amongst you may be wondering why I've got a photo of a bison or a wisent in the bottom right-hand corner there. I think one of the things we're going to need to do is probably think more constructively and laterally about what opportunities we've got for improving conservation outcomes on some of these sites. That's a European bison rather than a North American bison. And they're basically woodland animals. Because they're woodland animals, their necks are not very long. And that means that they prefer to browse on scrub rather than grass. So potentially they could play quite a significant role in management of both Ballykinler and Magilligan by using more natural methods to control the scrub growth. That would then mean we will have lower greenhouse emissions from not using quite so much heavy equipment. It'll keep our costs down, which will enable us to spend that money on arguably more beneficial activities. And it's just a much better way of doing things. And we can also cut our herbicide usage down. I'm not saying we'll ever necessarily get rid of herbicides and sort of mechanical scrub cutting altogether, but it's certainly something I would really like to try. The only problem I've had is actually getting hold of bison. They have a quite tightly controlled breeding program, and all the people I've spoken to so far have not been terribly interested in working with us on it, which is a bit of a shame, because I think, well, there was a study done on a dune system in, I think it was Holland, and the benefits from these things are enormous. So as well as having a different and arguably better grazing pattern, they also do other things like wallow in the sand, and that helps to keep patches of sand open. So that would achieve another one of our objectives. So that's the sort of direction I'd like us to be going in. You know, acknowledging that there are problems, but also looking at some of the opportunities really about how we can do things differently and better. Yeah, and that's, I think, pretty much everything I was going to say. So, yeah, thank you for listening to me drone on for, I don't know how long it is now. I've not looked at my clock for a while, but yeah, it's 8:45. It's probably definitely time I stopped talking, I think. So happy to take any questions, and if you all want to unmute yourselves, I will deal with your questions as best I can.